Okay, it looks like we're live, guys. So if you guys are joining live on LinkedIn, say hello, don't be shy. Today we're hosting the ESG Finance webinar with a bunch of amazing people here today. Brendan and myself was just so honored to be able to share this webinar with you guys. And so just to kind of quickly introduce the panel before we dive into the presentation side of things, we've got Justin Frank, Hemant Sethi from Zero Circle, and Joel Coward on the call with Brendan and myself. And so, I'm just really thrilled to have people on for this amazing webinar. And I'm just going to quickly check that it's all good on LinkedIn. It looks like it is. So yeah, feel free to say hello and ask questions as well throughout the session. We're kind of going to keep this quite conversational and organic. So yeah, just jump in and get involved in our conversation. So I'm going to share my screen as well and kick it off. So Brendan, maybe you can tell us a little bit about yourself while I do that and while I get the screen sharing.
Thanks, Meryl. And I'd also like to pay acknowledgement to our First Nations people. I'm coming here from Bidigal people of the Eora Nation territory. And welcome to everybody in this webinar. My background, in very brief, come from a longer history in supply chain. My awareness of sustainability has been for many years, but in effect, the last number of years, I've certainly progressed my passion in this space. And on this particular topic of ESG financing, I'm certainly passionate about educating and making people a lot more aware of the benefits of this to support organizations in their drive towards, let's say, net zero targets and decarbonisation. So that's a little bit about me.
Well, thank you for sharing, Brendan, and I really appreciate you also acknowledging country. That's really valuable to me as well. And thank you for taking charge on that. I appreciate it. And so I just wanted to kick off with, today's discussion is really going to be a panel type discussion. We want to be sharing the topic around ESG finance and kind of going into the understanding of what this concept is and how it's really rapidly taking over the market. Started off with this idea of green finance and supporting very environmentally focused projects. And now we're starting to see more and more businesses focusing on the broader sustainable scope around all four pillars of sustainability. And that's where ESG finance really sort of helps us do that. And so I'll just sort of tell you a little bit about what we're going to cover today. Where, of course, I'm going to introduce the panel a little bit more and dive into the topic of ESG finance, talk about the hurdles, what do many businesses face in terms of ESG finance, what are the financial avenues in this space, and how can we prepare your organization to at least benefit from the framework of ESG financial systems. And so a little bit about Succinctus, if you're new and don't know much about our business, we're a strategic consulting firm supporting businesses in sustainable consulting, primarily around ESG and governance, and building out those roadmaps that are accountable, measurable, verifiable, and take them down that pathway of becoming more circular and decarbonizing. So that's what we do. And my colleague and I, Brendan, here today, we're hosting this panel of incredible colleagues of ours. We've got Justin Frank, who is a sustainable advisor and consultant, Hemant Sethi, who is a climate and fintech sustainability specialist, and Joel Coward, who is focused on the ESG and sustainable value chain space. And so we're really pleased to have you all here today, guys.
Good to be here.
If anybody wants to just say hello as well to the group, we've got Sandeep, Peter saying hello on LinkedIn as well, who are joining us today. So essentially I will go into our first sort of area that we're covering, which is really to talk about ESG finance. I mean, Brendan, I'm probably going to turn it over to you for you to really introduce this. So you can go for it from there.
Thank you. No, great. And look, I'll do the intro, but then there's great expertise on this panel, so I certainly
Yeah.
welcome all the rest to jump in and contribute. I suppose
Yeah.
the reality is ESG finance, it's got a few different terminologies. You've got sustainable finance investment. And ultimately, the reality is it's becoming more and more prevalent. The last number of years, the rate of investment across ESG based financing has been accelerating exponentially. If we look in very recent times at the US under Biden administration and their Inflation Reduction Act, that's caused a huge mass of investment across ESG focused areas. Europe has had similar trends. I guess Australia is certainly laggard in that respect at this point of time. However, it's been seen as an extremely viable means from an investor's perspective to seek from an impact perspective or social perspective, where your funds are directed towards ESG or E and S pillars in particular. The patterns, I guess, are demonstrating the absolute need for the decarbonisation and rapid growth of acceleration of decarbonisation. And ultimately, it's also becoming a mandate from the shareholders in terms of how organizations are looking at facing towards net zero and how they're becoming sustainable in their own right. It's framed by a lot of standards, albeit maybe others could speak to the standards, but there's still a lot of work to be done in terms of how this is far more standardized than what is present. I might pass it over to other
Yeah.
colleagues if they'd like to comment, actually, because others have got very direct experience of managing financing for their organizations.
Yeah, definitely. It'd be great to hear your thoughts, guys, who are on the panel. And I just wanted to say as well, those who are on the live, to please feel free to drop your questions in as well into the comments. But yeah, I mean, maybe Justin, you'd like to share some of your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I've been very lucky. So, Justin Frank, I've got 20 years plus experience working directly in circular economies. So, 15 years almost for Brambles or CHEP. So, probably the best physical example of a circular economy you'll find at scale. And then 5 years in the waste management, recycling, and water management and recycling industries. Very, very fortunate to have spent 2 decades in very purpose-driven, sustainable businesses that are global. So my life was a bit easy in terms of getting ESG financing because it came predominantly from retained profits and linked straight to the purpose and the strategy of the business. But you definitely saw, certainly when you work for an ASX business, that the shareholders and the stakeholders are very keen on your ESG strategy and moving from just an annual report to an integrated report. A big move there, so that the numbers aren't just about the dollars, but they're also about your whole supply chain and your whole impact. Now that I've moved into consultancy, I've seen a very different view. I'm on an advisory board for a small startup and working in different circular economy projects and looking how they're getting financed. So seeing the rise of crowdfunding, so citizens can get involved in the ESG piece, but also more sophisticated investors who bring something to the table might be a better option for some startups that are moving to the next stage of growth. So lots of different options out there. It's been quite fun to see some of the crowdfunding options and the marketing campaigns that go with them out there. I mean, there's been a good one with Cbin recently, but also Recycle Smart, who I advise for. Great to see the passion to get innovative ideas up and running and finance behind them.
Yeah, definitely. It's interesting that you say that, and I think So I did a live yesterday as well, just to talk about green finance and ESG finance in this space as it's developing. And I think that there was a talk that I attended. It was like sort of a COP adjacent talk with Bill Gates, who had attended and was saying, it's so important that we support, just sort of on your point of innovation, that we support more and more innovation and R&D through our business itself, for the greater good, not just for the purpose of improving our business, but for the greater good, that we're bringing the best of ideas to the forefront in our industries, in our sectors. So there's a real value as well for ESG finance, or this sort of type of finance with that lens at the front of it to support the best solutions out there in different sectors.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, yeah. So Hemant, I mean, if you could sort of tell us a little bit as well about what you think. I mean, you've come from more the fintech space and having worked in Dun& Bradstreet and working around risk and enterprise
Yeah.
management as well.
Yeah, no, thank you, Meryl, for that. And yeah, just my background has been in data analytics and product development for many years, specifically focused on risk management and risk solutions for large enterprises. And sustainability and ESG risk has started to become a big part of every customer risk program. And one of the challenges I see, especially in the small and mid-sized segment of the customers, are that they're looking for working capital, they're looking for financing, but they don't know how to kind of tap into this new wave of ESG financing that's happening, because the requirements are still very undefined. They don't really have standard methodologies. The frameworks are not, nobody's aligned on the framework. Everybody has their own frameworks they're following. So it's still a little bit of a wild west in terms of how people are even qualifying for this and even accepting these. Now, if we take some of the larger initiatives and larger projects, like, let's say I want to install like a, $100 million solar farm, those things have certain methodologies that our companies are following, specifically around the green bond principles and frameworks around that. And large banks do follow those principles, effectively. And I think the last I saw, there was about 1.4 or 1.5 trillion dollars of capital that have been invested in sustainable finance through these large initiatives, right? But the challenge is, how do you scale that down to your everyday business, right? Most businesses are not those big companies, and most businesses are $100 million, $50 million, $250 million businesses. And for them to tap into this, there needs to be some standardization and simplicity that these companies have to go through to essentially get through financing needs and get through their working capital needs. And the hypothesis is that over the next 5-10 years, every financing decision is going to be an ESG financing decision. So that is bound to happen, just with the natural resources requirements that many of these companies face, as well as the fact that if you don't integrate climate and ESG into your business operations, you are not necessarily going to be set up for the long term. So it is definitely going to be a big part, and I feel like ESG financing specifically, is going to be a strong carrot to incentivize a lot of the companies to transition towards this new economy and next generation of business operations.
Yeah. I mean, we've had a question come in as well from Sandeep over on LinkedIn. He's saying, so what are the mechanisms to track ESG funds via a normal fund? So I'm not sure if I understood the question. If you guys did. So it's really just, what are the mechanisms to track ESG funding, I believe?
Yeah.
Yeah,
there's no easy way to do that. And I think right now there are certain companies that have created specific ESG funds, basically looking at ESG factors from published by some of the public corporates, and essentially creating portfolios and funds that are geared towards those metrics and those calculations. In addition to that, I know a couple of startups that are actually doing some innovative work in that space, essentially trying to drive ESG-based signals as part of fund allocation or investment management practices and things like that. So it is still a very early and nascent stage. I don't think it's mainstream by any means. But you can find certain ESG-based funds, and I know a few of them. If you want to reach me offline, I can kind of point you to some of them. That actually you can invest in ESG funds as just as an individual, trying to invest in a mutual fund, or as a corporate trying to invest in kind of funds that might meet some of the criteria that you're looking for, right? But like I said, it's still a very nascent stage, and it's going to take a while before it becomes a lot more mainstream. In addition to that, there is also a little bit of political issues around the terminology ESG. That kind of tied to tied to the funding side of it, tied to the investment side of it. Hopefully that'll all subside over the next couple of years. But right now there seems to be a little bit of political backlash as well in terms of using the word ESG and greenwashing and things like that. So we're going through a change. We're going through an evolution. So we're going to see a little bit of ups and downs. But there are some very creative companies that are trying to create funds around that as well.
Yeah, definitely. I've certainly come across some myself, and hopefully this sort of journey towards a consolidated ESG financial framework is quicker than say the sustainability reporting frameworks have taken, and they've taken the long route, but they're certainly getting there themselves as well. So hopefully we have some learnings from that process. But it'd be good to hear from you, Joel, in terms of your experience around ESG projects and financing, and how this has sort of developed over the last few years.
Yeah, no, great. And thanks for inviting me, and good to see everyone here today as well. So look, I come at things from a sort of the more Cro-Magnon end of the finance spectrum, which is the mining end of things. And mining is always a really interesting space, because mining is the top and the bottom of a supply chain. It's critical to decarbonisation. It's critical to how we eat, how we live. And it's a very misunderstood industry. So just for context, I'm a mining and petroleum lawyer specialising in environment and human rights law, and I've operated across areas like Congo and Indonesia and Southeast Asia for a long time. And minerals traceability and transparency is key to that. So from our perspective, and from this perspective, whether you're looking at a BHP or a Rio Tinto or a smaller, mid-cap like Oz Minerals, which has just been bought by BHP, what's been really interesting from our perspective has been, one, that ESG and investment is now critical. It is your project funding, whether that be, one example was working on was a $1.6 billion nickel mine here in Australia. ESG was a critical component, but it was E, S, and G, not just E, which was really interesting. And that was really interesting from de-risking that project, which then, of course, has market risks and shareholder risks as well, and stakeholder risks. But then what was also really interesting was then working with a smaller cap miner who could not get funding because the ESG was so bad. And so they were really, really stuck. That had a consistently poor ESG ratings, that had consistently poor performance. And one of the great challenges we're seeing now is how to quantify and qualify, because you need both, E, S, and G. Traditionally, we've looked at E, environment, or emissions. It's relatively quantifiable. It's easy to sort of calculate. It bases it back into finance. But when you start to move into the interconnection between E, S, and G, S and G tend to be a lot more qualitative and quantitative. So that becomes trickier. And one of the great challenges right now, or one of the great threats, but also is a great opportunity, is when you look at, when you've, on the second point there, investing relies on independent ratings, for example. It's what are those ratings covering right now, whether it be a DJSI or MSCI or Sustainalytics, or there's a variety of them. And that's one of the great threats right now, is that's seen as the whole truth. It's a company gets a good rating on MSCI or DJSI, thus they are sustainable. But if you don't understand those ratings, you suddenly realize, actually, that's a peer-to-peer rating. So it's like, who's an inch off the bottom and who's slightly higher off the bottom? It's not actually, and it very rarely, though, is evolving, capturing the greater S and G side. And we can talk about it later, but that's interesting when you look at it from a double materiality risk space. If you're reporting under SEC, for example, on what is a material risk when you look at climate or sustainability to your business, both how that impacts on you and then how you impact on that threat.
Yeah, no, it's a really good point that you're bringing up. I think it's sort of leading to one of the questions as well that's come through, not necessarily the connection between the ESG, but specifically, for these smaller businesses, how do they still get access to this kind of quantifiable or this sort of measurable process, because it is so administrative, it is so complex. And we've got Kieran who's asked, do you see ESG that will be suited to target more of the startup space or existing smaller businesses, I think. And that's an interesting question. I mean, if anyone has any thoughts on that, that would be great to hear from you guys.
Yeah, no, I mean, personally, I think it's all of the above, right? I think every company is going to have to do it. Now, the question is, why are they doing it? What's the requirement for doing it, right? Right now, there's no regulatory pressure yet for the smaller mid-sized companies to do this today. So that's not driving the reporting and driving the initiatives within the organization. So it now comes down to your shareholders and stakeholders, right? Whether it's your management team or your investor or your customers driving this kind of information that that you will have to share with your stakeholders. That makes sense. So they are usually the driving force for it today, at least for the small and mid-sized companies. And then from a financing perspective. If you're an existing business, you have better chance of getting financing, specifically around loan programs and grants and things like that. And you need to be able to show some level of financial stability before you can actually activate those loans or tap into those loan programs. And ESG just becomes a little bit of another reporting requirement that you need to do to show where you stand, how we're going to improve, and then meet some of the covenants of the loans, right? So it's there's no kind of one size fits all, unfortunately. And I think what Kieran said is right. It's not easy for small and mid-sized companies to actually do this today. The time, effort, complexity that's required is very difficult, and there's no universal standard, and that's the biggest issue. There was some universal standard. We're all talking some universal language. Then that at least there's some level of standardization and simplicity. But there's so many different frameworks, so many different standards, and every government and company are operating in slightly different kind of languages, as Joel said, like MSCI versus Bloomberg versus Sustainalytics. They're all different languages of the same topic. So it's hard to know which one to actually follow and which one to actually hang your hat on as part of some of the frameworks that to leverage.
Well, if I could jump in there too, as well, just to complement that. And I think it not just depends on the size of the business. I think in the jurisdiction you're operating in too.
Correct. Yeah.
And I think that has caused some real challenges. So, for example, Greater Europe and the EU is moving rapidly and advanced, but even there, and I say that having been with a large European bank the other day, they still are getting to terms with this because they're also only looking at their patch versus that value chain, let alone the greater circularity of resources and people and profits. And I think that's really interesting. So you've got this capability gap and a capacity gap as well. So you don't understand the capability, so you don't understand the capacity to react and respond to it. And that really does change, to in a different region. I mean, ESG has different meanings in say Greater China, for example. Will have a different, and so when you're trying to do that assessment on them, they could say, well, we've got these policies, or we've got these processes. You say, well, that's great, but that does not satisfy what we need, but it does there. So there is the need for a standardization, and that would make it a little easier. And I think that will come. It's just sort of everybody at the moment, let alone whether you're big or small, is not sure what to do. And even within a big company, and I say that coming out of a very large mining company, that can still even be isolated by quite vertical groups at the moment. So one group might have quite a good understanding of it, and another part of the business doesn't. So it's everywhere across business is struggling in this space.
Yeah, I think you also need to really focus on the sector that you actually play in, because there's a huge amount of grant funding out there. If we talk from an Australian perspective, you've got federal level grants and you've got state level grants, and then you've got grants for different things as well. So you might be actually quite a sustainable business or a purposeful business or a societal outcome business, but you might actually have a tech platform that delivers that. So not only can you start to get funding through recycling grants or environmental grants or carbon reduction grants or whatever is out there, you can also tap into the innovation grants that are out there as well. So the challenge is certainly if you're a startup, is the admin burden of applying for them and tracking them all. But there are ways and means to do that. And if you're a slightly larger company with an overhead that has a headcount that has potential capacity in there, is how can you take away some non-value added work that people are doing and replace it with, give someone actually the role to follow these grants that are out there and go for them and apply for them, because there's a lot that's left on the table every year in terms of grant funding.
Yeah, many of the grants are either underutilized or not effectively utilized. And so, it's a real opportunity for small businesses and startups. But I think really, sort of just from my perspective to answer your question, Kieran, and add to what all these great people have already shared, is that it really is complex for businesses of any size, small, medium, large. And so it really is a process of going step by step by step. So first, what's your materiality? And then go from there. What's the gap for where your business wants to move from now until the future? And then how do we close that gap? And that's just that process. Obviously, there's many more steps to it, but I think that it's administrative and complex for any business. And so it's just a matter of talking to somebody and actually kicking off that first step. So, in terms of, the hurdles, what do businesses face across governance, strategic, physical, transitional risks? The World Economic Forum has obviously done a lot of work in this space and identified sort of the top 10 risks, which, if we look at the TCFD, for example, which is a task force on climate-related financial disclosure, it's about what are the climate risks and then what are the financial impacts on the business and how do we mitigate those risks. So it's really a ESG finance platform, so to speak, and these are hurdles being faced by all businesses, just obviously to different extents depending on their interactions with their supply chain and the size of their supply chains as well, and of course their operations. So does anybody have any sort of thoughts around this particular slide? It'd be good to sort of understand what you've identified in your own experience as major hurdles, maybe with stakeholders.
I can make a comment, and I'd like to pick up on something that Joel said, which sort of lends into this actually. So this identification of your ESG materiality, it's very much you need to look outside your organization. You can sort of measure the materiality within your own direct supply chain, but the real point of this is understanding the impact that it has beyond or in future. So, does it have impacts down the line that are negative to environmental or social humanitarian issues, perhaps? And I think it starts with probably, I'll go back to some basic principles here of how organizations have set themselves up under their SDGs. What are their core SDGs that they're committed to, and how do they manage through the metrics and the index of the SDGs? That then builds into some of the other ESG-based reporting that they'll be required to do. I think if we look at small organizations, this is probably where it gets very complex and maybe challenging to where do you start. But I think there's some really good simple pillars or frameworks that can allow organizations to understand the basic metrics, how they align to their organization and maybe in their industry and their supply chains and through their customers, and then get some benchmarking across, simpler reporting, working within the areas of scope reporting as well, which sort of comes into it. Because, the simple thing has been said in lots of different occasions, what you can't measure, you can't manage. And the thing is, measurement is going to be required, for lots of different reasons, for compliance, for regulatory reporting, but also from, if you're seeking investors, you need to be able to demonstrate and present your best case.
I think on top of that, just to complement that, it's a space of saying not just you need to demonstrate it in an increasingly rapid sense, you're going to have to prove it. So, so proof to profit versus, traditionally, a lot of, PR to profit. Oh, we're doing the right thing and we've made commitments. Isn't that wonderful? But now you're going to have to move it. But if you can break it down to, if you're a small to medium business or even a big business, principles to policy, policy to process, process to practice, practice to proof, and that's the important part. And that really runs into your revenue and your finance stream, which is why finance is important. I never thought I'd ever say that as a lawyer, but it is important. And proof to profit, saying what you're gonna do, because how you buy and operate will define how you sell and who invests to be market relevant in the future. And one of the great benefits of being a small to mid-sized organization right now is you're taking new concepts, but you have the agility to adapt and implement those processes well and quickly and fast. Whereas, one of the real challenges, you get a big Fortune 500 company, or you get a big ASX 100 or ASX top 10 company, trying to embed these things and then turn the ship across 80,000 people is really challenging. So there is a joy of being smaller and having that ability and adaptability quickly, but also then that ability to integrate innovation and new ideas, new technology quickly as well. But also, one of the big things to Brendan's point about the UN Sustainability Development Goals is some people are just stuck on that and they go, no, we've only got these 5 goals. Well, as your information and appears and as your data improves and as they will change and adapt. This is not a one size permanent thing. It's going to adapt and grow. So don't get stuck on stupid or get stuck on singularity. So.
Yeah, it's a really, really great point, what you're talking about, Joel, because just, I guess, with anybody's work, I mean, they can all sort of relate to this idea where I know even from my own experience in the energy space, really looking at efficiency and optimization, you go and change the setting on a pump here, and it doesn't just improve the pump flow, in that one point, but it also then improves the bottlenecks that were being faced down the line. Maybe it's, I don't know, I'm just trying to think of some examples, like the boiler down the pipeline is working more efficiently because this pump has been changed to a better setting. So everything interacts with each other, and that's just a very simplified example. But the reality is that we're talking about social capital, human capital, economic capital, environmental capital, and so they're all very closely interconnected through the social systems and relationships amongst people, probably most importantly, and that's so kind of qualitative. So you really need to kind of look at that and consider that it is a very quickly evolving space, and it's not just one size fits all. So even I know when we speak to clients, we don't just say we'll give you a 3-year roadmap and you're done and dusted, you're good to go. It's like, let's look at the first year. We will give you an idea of what 3 years looks like, but let's look at the first year and then let's talk about this again and again and again, because it's going to keep changing.
I think that's a good point, because we've come out of a sort of a generation, 20 years, maybe even 30 years, probably longer than that, of having, the big management consulting firms come in and they plonk down a strategy or a roadmap and they say, here, go do this. And the challenge with that is that works in relatively simple, linear, processes, which sort of suits a lot of engineering headspace, for example. But the challenge is we're dealing with ESG. There's 3 separate topics, which are an ecosystem that can be, as you said, if you tweak one thing there, it can impact another thing there. And the great challenge with that is, but also the great opportunity is ESG does need to be reviewed frequently. Is this aligned to how we're doing? It needs to be more objective based. How do we achieve this objective versus step 1, step 2, and where it's command and control. So, and that's really difficult, I found, especially in the big houses, because people are used to, overanalyzing, and we've got an army of economists that will come down and say, and provide certainty, but we are living in an uncertain space in this. So there does need to be that element of agility and flexibility to say, well, we thought our emissions were, say, 1,000 tons, 100,000 tons a year. But actually, with better data, we found out that it's 150,000 tonnes. That's okay. This is good because we're solving the problem. Because remember, it's not about you. It's not about the company. It's about people and planet and profit all coming together. And that's what's really great, because ESG is the greatest enabler for change culturally, performance-wise, for efficiency. You can preserve money, save money, and create new money with it. It's a great enabling tool. So I'd also like to throw that in there. Don't be scared by this. If anyone this is new to them for the first time, don't be scared by it. It is complex, but it's also really manageable.
I'd also add that, if you don't know where to start, I agree with Brendan. Starting with the UN SDGs is absolutely probably the easiest place to start, right? One, when you do it, I've done it a few times now, but when we mapped everything that we did and everything we wanted to do back to which SDG framework it touched. And it's such a rewarding process in itself. But then when you do it, you then get kind of a comms pack, because you can start to use it internally, which has a multiplier effect on employee engagement. And as you get more engaged employees because they understand better what you do, well, then that's a direct correlation to improve customer satisfaction and experience, because they're more bought into what you're doing. But then you can start to plot the different financing mechanisms around each SDG. So you can split them out, almost do, mind maps or bubble maps or spider diagrams or whatever you want to call them, and say, right, for life on land, these are the different grants that are available. These are the different large corporates, if you're a startup, that play in this space, because that's another financing option. Is a lot of these large corporates have their own grant funding pieces. We certainly did for a while at Suez. We'd have our own community grants, and you can start to align with larger organisations that might not necessarily give you the grant straight away, but they certainly might have a conversation with you, and then suddenly you're tapping into knowledge of experts that have scaled a business to a certain extent. So if you're not certain what to do, I think that is the easiest starting point, to just map how your business links back to those SDGs, where you want to take it and how that would link to it, and then use that as a starting framework to develop financing strategies from it.
Justin, did you find when you did that for the first time, what were your realizations when you started mapping those SDGs on your business internally and externally in terms of value chain and interconnectedness? Did you see a trend or a pattern in that, or and how did that?
So I did it with my sustainability manager as a start. I had two massive whiteboards in the office, and we did it, and it stayed there for the rest of my time in that role. And what it did was, whenever I was having a pretty rubbish day, right, and they happen, right, in big business, I could just take 5 minutes, take a breath, look at the wall and go, I'm working for a business that touches every single SDG in one way or another. Peace and strong institutions was maybe a long bow, but if you don't have water, you're going to have civil war, right? So there was a bit of a long bow there with the water, but pretty much everything else, we had projects or business activities that align back to the SDG goals in each goal. So it was a really uplifting piece of work, and again, it then gives you a common language. So internally, in all your newsletters or prezos, you can start to use it, but externally, if people don't really understand what your business does, it's a global framework. So suddenly, if you can link it back to one of the goals, or 5 of the goals, or 17 of the goals, if you're lucky enough, suddenly, even if someone isn't completely getting what you do, they can see at least it links to something that I do understand and can grasp. So rather than reinventing the wheel, you've got a very engaging framework, very colourful framework, can brighten up customer pamphlets, it can brighten up your website, but it can straight away, either consciously or subconsciously, get an interested party around your value proposition a bit quicker. If it's a complex sell.
And that's really. Sorry.
Yeah, go on, Joel.
I was going to say, and that's really important. What Justin was saying there was, and it's interesting when you go, if you do have to do annual sustainability reporting, whether that's be financial or non-financial reporting, depending on the size of your company, it's a really cathartic process to go through and say, what are the core things we need to report under? And how does that link to our SDGs? How did we move the ball forward and the game forward? And that's really cathartic to see, because one of the great challenges in this sustainability space, or ESG as a whole, is it does feel Sisyphean at times. There's those days where you go, oh, I don't feel like I've made a difference. I don't think I've done anything. And you suddenly go back, to Justin's point, and you go, who am I working for? I'm working for people, I'm working for the planet. Oh, this work we did today might have seemed not very exciting, but it will work towards gender equality, or First Nations, or meaningful work, or peace and justice. And that's also good for a company in a world where everything is doom and gloom at the moment. Whether it be inflation or this, to go, actually, the way we work every day, the way we spend our money, the way we borrow our money, the way we lend our money, actually is hopefully helping people and planet, as well as profits. So
I really love what both of you just sort of talked about collectively, Justin and Joel, just because for me, I always said as well to businesses, start with the UN SDGs, but more from the perspective that, hey, there's about 200 countries that have signed up to this ratified Paris Agreement. But it's so much more than that, what you've touched on here, which is purpose. It's giving people that opportunity to connect down deeply with why they're really here and what they're doing. And when they're feeling that climate anxiety, which is real, I know I felt it, you can go back and say, actually, this is what I'm impacting here. There's so much more to it than what I'm feeling just right now in this moment. So that's really beautiful. Thanks for sharing your thoughts on that. I guess we can move on to, the next slide is really about what are the avenues now for businesses to access sustainable finance or ESG finance. I mean, Hemant, maybe you could share a little bit about your experience and the work you're doing as well.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. There's a lot of avenues right now. Most of the big banks have certain programs and initiatives that are driving towards, green investment, green funds, green financing. There's a ton of government grants that are starting to pop up all over the world, both at the national level and also the state and regional level as well. So it's hard to keep track of some of these things that are going on, especially at the kind of the local levels, right? What kind of programs are available for specific types of organizations as well. And it's a very much an evolving space. I think, as the top tier banks the second tier banks start to incorporate these into their programs, you're going to start to see a proliferation of investments and opportunities for companies to, tap into financial instruments, whether it's, just for investment purposes like mutual funds or assets or investment kind of vehicles, or for loans or for equities. So there's a lot of ways that different companies are trying to create different instruments that you as a business and a company can start to use as part of your business operations, whether it's, tapping into a loan or tapping into kind of using that as part of an equity assessment. So it is starting to become a lot more, interesting. I would say I don't think it's mainstream yet, but I think it's definitely getting a lot more interesting. In addition to that, as part of many of these programs that are focused on, let's say EV installations or solar panel installations, there's subsidies that governments are providing if you are starting to, do some of those programs as well. So those are another avenue to kind of tap into. It says, you just want to decarbonize your office facility or location. Now you can install, solar panels, and you can essentially get a subsidy for that, right? There's a lot of ways that you can start to be creative, but it kind of goes back to that. There's no one-stop shop for this. We have to kind of try to find the different programs that are available within your jurisdiction, within your locations, and see what makes sense for your business operations that you can tap into.
Yeah, that's really helpful, Hemant. Thanks for sharing. And I guess there's those sort of more obvious external sort of government-based incentives as well, and programs and schemes that are out there. But I guess, as you said, there's that internal program development as well, and even just a business taking that first step that leverages finance or resources for that next step and so on. That can be considered in itself an ESG finance avenue, just because you're leveraging funds or resources for those ongoing progress for your business.
Correct.
So,
But it also ties to what I think,
yeah.
Justin and Joel were talking earlier about, you need to know what activities you're doing. So if you kind of start to map out with, SDGs or GRI, whatever those frameworks you use, then
Yeah.
you'll know where you can invest and where you want to put additional investments into those activities. Because at the end of the day, it's not just about business operations; it's about connecting it to the SDGs and to the activities around the people, planet, and community at large. That becomes more material and more interesting than just a regular business operations and working capital that you're looking for, right? So I think that first step is still required, regardless of whether you're accessing green finance or not. You still need to quantify or identify the sustainable activities
Yeah,
within your
definitely.
ecosystem before you can actually go into that program.
Yeah, and I'll pick up on something there, Hamath, because you're absolutely right. The type of financing that your organization or business may be seeking, as Hamath said, there's just a proliferation now of financing, loans, debt, equity, investment opportunities. Some of them are very, very specific to the metrics that you need to report to. So accordingly, you may have one that's very specific to the metrics of the project that it's investing in. So it's
Yeah.
tied to maybe particular capital or asset investment. And then you might have another program where there's funding being made available, but it's not specific to the absolute of that project. It might be put to the broader benefit of that organization from a sustainability or decarbonisation. So, understanding the intricacies is probably getting more detailed here, but it just goes to show that there's lots of different opportunities and availability of different funding models for organizations who want to take a serious look at this.
Yeah, and I think that has a further flow-on effect as well, that once you get in and establish there, you start to see the benefits of those programs. So, for example, you get sustainability funding to be able to put in solar and, de-risk this, that, whatever that might be. And then you see that flow-on effect further, downstream in your own operations, where you'll say, oh, actually, we're de-risking this risk. So potentially our insurance premium may drop as well. So, which is great. So again, the flow-on effect of that is you suddenly, again, are saving money. It's improving your insurance premiums. It's improving your access to credit. It's there's a host of greater roles there, and I'm interested to see what the group thinks about the role of, as metrics shape and evolve, how that will impact on access to credit and the view of ESG as a risk to credit and to lending. And that incurs, again, whether that be, from a mining perspective, we extend credit to customers. How do we rate our customers on that, for example? Or if you're an institutional bank, for example, and you're looking at funding a project, how does that impact it? How does ESG impact access to finance?
Yeah, you bring up a very good point, Joe, because one of the things I've actually read and seen is that for something like a large project, right? Let's say, a $150 million solar farm that, the bank is funding or something along those lines, right? The metrics for that and the benefits of that won't come out for a pretty long time, right? Because you need to do the installation, you need to kind of measure the performance and kind of actually go through, multi-year process before you start to see some of those intrinsic benefits. So like you said, better credit, better insurance premiums, better risk, all of that kind of stuff. But if you do the same kind of programs for some of the smaller operations, you can actually see those benefits much more quickly, right? And the vehicles, the investment vehicles don't, there's no standardized investment vehicle just yet for some of these smaller operations. But if we can start to build out these standardized programs for them, now you'll say, okay, I've installed 10 solar panels in my back office, and all of a sudden I don't have huge electricity bill, which means I don't have I have excess capital flow, which means I have low risk, which means I have low premiums. They can actually start to see that very, very quickly in a matter of years and months, not necessarily multi-year process for some of these large programs, right? So I think the more we can actually enable financing for the smaller scale, we can actually quantify those benefits better in the short term compared to some of these large initiatives that are multi-year processes that take a while for us to see the benefits. We can see the benefits, but it's to quantify them is going to take some time to actually get through the process.
It's a really great point, Hemant, especially because many small businesses are sort of apprehensive because of the sort of bigness and the complexity, I guess, of ESG and ESG finance in this case. But as you said, the benefits certainly trickle down much quicker because of the simplicity of their organizational structure. So it's a real opportunity.
Yeah.
And I guess it leads to the next part as well, which is really, how can organizations better prepare themselves to tap into this space? It'd be great to hear the group's thoughts.
Yeah, I think stakeholders. We've talked quite a lot about financial stakeholders, but your customers are pretty important, right? So, like your customers, you don't have a business. So, what are your customers worried about, and what do they value? And depending again what sector you're in, if you think about the S, the S and the G, there's overlap at times. So, if you want to do business with a government entity, you need to have a reconciliation action plan if you want to be serious about winning the business. Now, you should be doing the one anyway because it's the right thing to do. But if you haven't got one and you want to win some decent sized business, you need to have one. And that you can start to find gaps in your strategy because of it. Similarly with modern slavery. If you're a large organization with a complex supply chain and you're not across your modern slavery, suddenly you do have investment risk, but you also have customers that are testing you on this all the time through a multitude of different surveys, whether it's SEDEX or EcoVadis there's hundreds of them, right? So, and that becomes complex. I remember in my last role, we had 42 different auditing tools that we had to fill in across all our large customers to basically have an order qualifier. So it's not an order winner; it's an order qualifier to actually bid for the contract. So really thinking about what your customers are focusing on and trying to find gaps in your current strategy and fixing those gaps is very, very important. And a lot of those, I do believe, are in the S and the G space of the ESG.
Yeah,
I think
definitely.
there's a very
someone else speaking.
There's a very clear gap. There's a very clear overlap now between the ES and the G side, and I think one of the great things that is missed right now is when you look at the G governance, the law, even just starting as simple as, are we inside the law? What do we need? What are approvals that we actually need to operate? And knowing that as a basic, because remember, a lot of what we're doing still voluntary, though it's moving towards mandatory reportings and requirements, for example. But getting that foundation first is a really good sense of comfort sorry, let's just drop down. Oh no, there we go. There's a really good sense of comfort to be able to say, where are we? Where are our gaps? What to then move it forward. So, where we are today with our basic G, and how does that fit with the UN sustainability goals? And that's where the good stuff starts to happen, the march and the progress towards it. And it's okay when you've got gaps. I had a conversation with a very large chemical and fertilizer CEO, and we were talking about modern slavery. And she said, what does a good company look like for you? And I went, one with problems. Because if they've got problems, they're finding problems and they're finding solutions to solve those problems. And that's great. That's what we want to see. If it's perfect, then I'm going to worry. So it's okay to have gaps. You've got to start somewhere.
But I've worked in very industrial B2B industrial businesses, and with complex supply chains, very physical supply chains, and sometimes you do get it wrong, right? But if you get it wrong badly, right, you can and you impact your community that you're serving in, you get a lot of flare-ups, and you get a lot of media coverage as well. So not only does that damage your brand, and again you have to record these incidents on a lot of large customer tenders. But you also generally get pinged by EPAs, and you get fined, and you get improvement notices, and they go on your record as well. And if you're not careful, if you're not across some of these issues, you basically, the metaphor that we use was you're in a boat, and every time you don't do something right, or you don't have your governance right, or your risk models right, and something goes wrong, you're puncturing the boat, and water's coming in, right? So you're just slowing the boat down, and you've just won a contract, and you've worked really hard for years to win this big contract, big revenue contract, but when you come down to the profit, it's probably not as big. But then suddenly you've just lost some of that because you've done something wrong, because you didn't have your governance structure right, and you didn't manage your risk properly. And then the impact and the overspill into the S has just jeopardized a new infrastructure build, because you've suddenly got a community offside that have seen it all over the press. And, well, I don't want that person operating in my patch, or that business operating in my patch, because your social license is becoming so important in major builds, certainly factories, or things like energy from waste, or recycling facilities that do put noxious gases back into the atmosphere through their process. You undermine huge amounts of hard work. So whilst the E gets a lot of the limelight, the S and the G can really undermine your business model, and they can undermine your brand.
Yeah, we used to have a running comment back in one of the big houses that would say, when you're looking at sustainability, it involves both environmental and ethical. Right? So environment being a lot of water and waste and like emissions, and ethical can be human rights and modern slavery, and social and First Nations, and the sort of running commentary was always environment is easy and ethical is hard because you can't offset slavery, right? So it's so as such, it will take effort, and it is going to take time. The reporting standards we've got there, like GRI or TCFD or SASB, are good reporting standards, and that's how to shape the report. The challenge is with that, a lot of companies are still just producing that report, but then you need to start looking at how do you then mature that in due course to start measuring impact and effectiveness of your programs, and thinking about further down that to Justin's point, your customers and your stakeholders further down that chain, because for example, you may sell a product that and I'll use mining as example, or agriculture. You'll sell a product to China, for example, where they do not have as high standards, or the derivers aren't there, but then they'll move that through secondary manufacturing to a product that they'll sell to Germany. Germany does. So Germany will just come straight to you now as the raw material or the provider and say, could you please provide this via our extensive due diligence process? So it's worth doing, and it is also worth acknowledging what you're doing, what you're not doing, but when you will do it. So if you're saying, and take a risk-based approach, identify what's the core risks, your core material risks, and focusing on those, because you can't solve everything immediately, especially if you're small to medium. It's impossible. So that core risk-based approach, and start really focusing on that and recognizing what you can change, because you're better to show that, wow, these folks don't have it right, they don't have it perfect, but boy, they're moving forward with intent and purpose. That's great. And if you're supplying into a bigger company, that's really important to look at.
It's a really valid point that you're making, Joel, and Justin as well. What you've brought up, I guess, ties into what Kieran's sort of talking about, which is that he's seen that many of these councils, these governments are being so risk averse in their decision making, that there should be some sort of inclusion about, yes, there's the risk, and it's important to think about risk, but also how can we consider the impact, the value that we're adding through the value chain and operations. So yeah, I think there's an important place for this to consider calculated risk, really, like that it's okay to take some risk, that you can't just use past failures as a blanket statement that this is going to be another failure, so we're going to tighten our purse strings a little bit more. So it's interesting.
Risk should always be looked at as, and I'll challenge people to do it, to start thinking about it, saying, if you identify risk, what's the threat? What's the opportunity as well? Because they generally have both. And that sort of balances out that, paralysis that can occur where we just won't do anything or we'll sit still. And that's a good thing. The other thing I will throw in there as well is if you're not sure or you're better to disclose or you're better to say, hey, we're working on this and be honest about where you are versus PR, which then turns into greenwashing. And
Definitely.
real risk at that at the moment is, ASIC and the ACCC are looking at smaller companies and they're finding them. We've had 3, 4 recently in the last couple of months, and in the last 6 months, small to mid caps, because they're easier to go after than the big houses to start with, and that will influence the change. So it's that case of if you are starting on that ESG journey or you're looking to gain finance, be honest to where you are, and that's the joy of transparency versus saying, "Oh, it's all perfect, we're all great, it's all fantastic, we're green," and you're not.
Yeah, look, I will just make a quick note. I mean, we are at an hour mark. So for those who are joining us on LinkedIn, if you want to stay with us for another 15 minutes or so, I'm sure we have plenty more value to share with you. So we do hope you will stay with us. But I guess, continuing the conversation, Joel, and what you're saying that, gosh, I've lost my train of thought. It's okay. It's not important. Brendan, did you have a thought to share?
Yeah, something that sort of transcends or beyond, this whole piece. I think it comes with the leadership of an organization and the genuine intent in supporting the sustainability factors of the business. I often just say sustainability, while it's got its own definition, it's around, to sustain your business, you need to be in good business. And I think that comes to the factor of, as leaders, and I guess, all people in a business lead in different ways. So as leaders in an organization, you need to demonstrate some commitment. It can be difficult. Change is inevitably going to be difficult. But I think there's, as Joel has said, there's lots of opportunity. Justin would say the same thing, I'm sure. Working for circularity-based organizations, we are moving. The other piece here is we're moving from a linear to circularity economy. So the real opportunity here is how can we, rather than identifying things as waste, and it goes down to the end of a line without its value being realized, to actually capture opportunities with that and look at other parts of our supply chain. And I think we build then the opportunities for the collaboration, maybe partnerships with suppliers or parts of our supply chains. And it's sharing, what might be a common problem to a gained opportunity with that element of really going, how can we do better than what we've been doing, and it needs to keep moving forward.
And I think also it kind of ties into this recurring theme in our conversation, which is, you could think of things from a lack-based perspective, which is really what risk enterprise management looks at, or you could look at it from an impact-based perspective, which is really about abundance, purpose, sort of driving you forward. And I think that most organizations can then realize the potential for their organizations and less focus on the risks and the issues that they'll face, because if they focus on that and try to mitigate that, yes, of course they will mitigate it through the action they take, but they're obviously in that energy and that culture of more this avoidance sort of approach, which is not as effective in this new economy. This new economy is people-led, it's purpose-led, and people have so much buying power. I'm not just talking about individual customers, I'm talking about large-scale sort of supply chains have so much buying power and can really kind of make or break your business, especially if you're a smaller business. So there's another reason why smaller businesses as well need to be part of this journey, because they play an important role in the bigger picture.
Absolutely.
So I guess we could talk about the benefits, right? I guess this is the opportunities part. What are the benefits for businesses? And maybe Brendan, you'd like to share some of your thoughts on this.
Sure. So there's obviously a few things documented there. I'll come at it from perspective of sort of to the point I was saying earlier. If you're not on board, let's say with just ESG and sustainability genuinely, your organization or your business will get found out, because you will have to report. That will be coming at some point in the next few years as a mandatory requirement. If you're waiting to be regulated for reporting, there's a chance already that you're in a supply chain somewhere and your customers or your suppliers or your vendors or whomever are requesting information of you to demonstrate where you're at, in order to maintain contracts or renew contracts or be competitive on new tenders, sort of from a procurement process perspective, as you were saying, Meryl. So I think it's that brand piece. This is good for your brand. It's good, and I think people, and if I tie it, then you feel, from a human capital perspective, people like working for their businesses who are doing good, and that can be many different ways. But organizations who are doing the right thing and moving forward will be a lot more successful as well in not just retaining their existing talent, but attracting new talent. So you talk about a labor market at the moment where growth. If your business is growing, you'll obviously need to grow from a employee perspective, and you need to be able to position yourself with opportunity that you can present to people genuinely of what you're doing to improve your ESG. So I'll hand it over to others, but that's where I would sort of place some of the critical benefits.
Amazing. Yeah, you've really focused in on the brand and the reputation as well for the business. So if anybody wanted to sort of share those opportunities or those benefits, from a more maybe a qualitative perspective around risk or resilience, building resilience into your business, I'd love to hear from the group.
I can, if you can. One of the great things we did when we started doing, this is BHP, so biggest mining company in Australia, market cap $244 billion US, right? So not small. Most people are investing in it, whether they know it or not. And what was really interesting, when we started our Scope 3, this is a couple of years ago, modern slavery and Scope 3, so responsible and sustainable value chain, transparency. Started looking upstream. And what was really funny was when COVID came and there was all of a sudden what's going to happen to supply chains, and we're all, there was so much uncertainty about it. They called us and said, could you come and, where are we right now? What's the risks to our value chain? Because we could map it out. We mapped it out and figured it out, who was going what and where. And so we could start de-risking that value chain, because then the flow-on effect of that was then, could we keep producing for our customers? Because we were the top. And mining's fascinating because it's the top and bottom of a supply chain, right? So it's the top of our own. So we spend, $1 billion or 10 billion or 20 billion on upstream value chain, but then also with the bottom of everybody else's. You want an electric car, it's going to come from us. So it's really interesting. And we found in that space the opportunity is through understanding, good ESG means you understand how you buy. You can preserve money, because Scope 3 is about efficiencies, right? Efficiencies and consolidation versus replacement. So why do you need 15 types of trucks when you could actually just get one, there's an efficiency, there's a cost saving there. Plus there's also, the de-risking. You're de-risking your, these are all material risks to your business. So again, lower insurance premiums, ease of access, better rating, with credit. And then there's also the market access space. You can actually position your product better to be able to say, this is not, because everyone says we're sustainable. Well, you're transitioning towards sustainability. Like organics, there's a 7-year process if you want to have your farm certified to sell organic dried apricots. And there's a process to it. This is the same. And if you can evidence that, you can start to gain those premiums for a better product. Because what we found was when we did it with, and this is all publicly available information, by the way. So this is, with Tesla, there was a nickel deal between the two companies. It was great. We could trace that nickel. We used blockchain to do it, to trace down the value chain, emissions and modern slavery and human rights and quality and where that was going. It was beneficial ownership. Really, really interesting. And what we found out of that was efficiencies downstream for both parties and circularity opportunities too, where we could say, oh, we're selling to you and you make batteries and we need batteries. How do we do this together? And that moves business from just being sustainable to self-sustaining. And I'll always challenge anyone to say, how do you move business from a state of just being sustainable, which is admirable, but also moving it to a self-sustaining, where you become your customer's customer? You've got that really good approach. So
that's the beauty, I guess, of what the circular economy allows us to do, or even we think about these concepts like the circular economy, donut economy. And I think also to your point, Joel, which is that being sustainable, it's never really true. It's not absolute, because even with the accreditations, you've got to keep being accredited. You've got to keep proving that you're on this path, on this journey, but moving from that into a self-sustaining business, one that is kind of secure and resilient and really kind of ready to adapt to all of the climate impacts that they're going to face, certainly already facing and going to happen more rapidly as we go into the next few years. So it's really an opportunity for businesses to change tact. Sort of ties into all the other things we said, moving through purpose, moving through impact-based thinking, and then again, moving through self-sustaining sort of principles rather than being sustainable as an absolute term, because it's not really absolute, is it?
No. And it also helps de-risk things. So, for example, if you've got good ESG, what it does is traditionally you would look at, if you had an operation coming out of, say, Brazil or or Southeast Asia, they're generally high-risk jurisdictions, for human rights or jurisdictional risk or contracts or whatever. What you can then start doing is then actually de-risking that. So you can still say, yes, we manufacture in, Vietnam, or we manufacture in, Bangladesh, but here's our evidence, which actually shows that we are providing our people, a living wage, it's compliant and it's consistently applied, and we're reducing water, which means that you can still get the benefits of operating in those environments and all the good stuff that comes out of it too, but also de-risk that from a brand and a reputational point of view. And there's one other point, I've completely forgotten what it was. So.
That's all right. I guess if you do remember, please share it with us. It happens to me all the time. But Justin, Hemant, Brendan, did you want to share any sort of closing thoughts around this?
Yeah, for me, it's around talent. I think there's already a war on talent and talent attraction and retention, and I think if you've got your head around in your business across ESG, you've got a very good employee value proposition that you can put in place. And again, I'm a firm believer that EX transforms into CX. But I think as you look at the next generations that are on the streets marching. And really, fighting for their own future. You've got a whole pool of talent that's coming to the market in the not too distant future. That if you really are across this, you'll bring the best talent into your business, and that is massive from an innovation perspective, from a customer satisfaction perspective, and if you've got the right culture, you've got an inclusive culture where they bring the best to the table. You're setting yourself up for success,
and you get to keep them as well. They're happy being there.
Yeah,
it's a good point, Justin. Hemant, Brendan, did you want to share anything?
Yeah, just one kind of touching point on this is that it's all kind of interconnected, right? In a sense that, and I think that the panel kind of mentioned some of these earlier as well. It's not just the fact that you have to think about it in isolation. Everything is interconnected. Talent to brand to reporting to financing to growth. They're all starting to be much more interconnected. And ESG is just a way to communicate that interconnectedness in an easy way, right? So kind of making sure that you as a business are trying to make sure all these elements are kind of connected to each other. is going to be key for long-term success and long-term growth. Otherwise, it's not necessarily going to happen. You're going to be stuck in kind of short-term mindset for a while. And so I think that's one of the things to take away from this, why you should do this. Like, as a long-term business, if you want to be a long-term business, you have to think about all of these things as interconnected elements, and driving them all forward together rather than individually or in isolation.
Can I just
Yeah,
jump
it's a
in on
short-term sort of challenge like short-term in the challenge-based like thinking, but there's a long-term opportunity here for so many businesses in this new economy. So it's really interesting point, Hemant.
Can
And
I just
I
jump
guess
in?
oh, sorry, of course.
Yeah.
I was just going to say, can I just jump on a point? That's really important what Hemant said. What we're seeing right now is long-termism is the way forward. And what's really interesting to see, and the power of this is, if you look at executives and and leadership, short-term incentive scheme models, they are short-term. They are 1 year. So you're thinking year to year to year to year to year. And what we found was really powerful was when we moved away from that short-term STI thinking to a LTI, long-term incentive, that was over 3 years, that it was at the executives level and the leadership level, of which ESG was around 20 to 30%. And that was ongoing improvement based on a series of metrics, which is not albeit perfect, but it was a really good step change. And what that did was create, from the boards to the execs downwards, a headspace shift and a mindset shift to say this is important and this is okay. It doesn't need to be reactionary. It's planned, and we're all learning. All of us are learning. And that was really, really good across every element, whether it be people, whether it be exploration, marketing, trading, procurement, and that also encouraged that consistent shift forward. So thinking that long-termism is a really good culture change, I found. Sorry, and I'll shut up now.
I love that. I love that cultural shift that you have observed, Joel. Thanks for sharing that. I think that's a huge one. So, yeah, really interesting perspective, an obvious example as well.
One final comment for me, Meryl, because I
Course,
realize
Brandy.
we'll be closing out, but absolutely, thank you to Justin, Hamath, Joel, yourself, Meryl, for hosting today. The last point I'd make is this is a journey. It's not a race. And organizations who haven't yet started, I guess there are simple ways to get started. And it's about the sharing, the openness. I think a lot of people are concerned about what the results might say, but there has to be an honesty with the reporting that comes out of this. But it's an opportunity to start improvement and that
It's
engagement.
Yeah, look, that's a really great point you make, Brendan, and I love that the issue, what you've said, really, that it is about being completely honest and transparent, and you'll actually benefit through this process of just sort of opening up this conversation and dialogue. But I think on your point that there is a simple first step, and it's about just taking it. What really leads to it's a bit of a segue to the next part, which is just to close off. How we want to be able to help businesses is make this accessible, regardless of your size, and so. What we're doing is a sustainability assessment. It's something that you can just reach out to me directly. I'm happy to sort of point you in the right direction of how you can get something like this done for your business. But it's really about just assessing what are the material impacts from your business operations in alignment with two of the key global frameworks, which is GRI and SASB. And so if you haven't sort of looked at that yet, this is a low cost avenue for businesses to go down. $500 to be able to assess your sustainability impact, look at the materiality, and then lead onto a conversation and an exploration of what are the opportunities for your business. So this is a way to get started. It's a way to kind of lower the barrier to entry for smaller businesses and bring everybody along on this journey, because it really is a collective journey. We all need to sort of be a part of it. So that's what I wanted to end off with, and I want to really thank each of you for being here today. I do really appreciate the time the effort that you've spent. And those of you that have stayed with us as well on the call or joined later on, or joined for some part of it, really appreciate you being here and giving us your time. It's highly valuable, so I do really appreciate it. I'm sure the rest of the group does as well. If you wanted to reach out to anybody here in the group and you couldn't find their details, you can obviously let me know. I'm happy to put you in touch. And if you wanted to reach out about a sustainability assessment as well, let me know. And we'll certainly point you in the right direction, no matter what your query is. So thank you, everybody, for joining. And thank you to all of you on the panel here today. And we'll be ending this live now. So take everybody and have a wonderful rest of your day, and hope to talk to you all soon. Thank you,
Thanks,
everyone.
everyone.
See you, folks.
Thank you.